I remember the phone call came in about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, and not that that's unusual for calls. It used to, if you remember, before cell phone days, the phone was attached to your wall, and sometimes you had cordless or corded. And I heard through my door the muffled, "Hello, who is this?" and went from my dad being very unawake and wondering why is someone calling this early in the morning to a tone that shifted. His tone got very serious but calm and present. I heard him say, "Thank you, we'll be right there." Hung up the phone, walked to his bedroom with my mom, talked with her briefly, and then he got changed, and he walked into each of us kids' rooms and said, just knocked very quietly, said, "Turn off your alarms, you're not going to school today. Your sister's been in an accident. We need to go, but stay here. We'll call you with more details later." And I just thought, here's a day off of school in middle school, woohoo, I don't have to go. I don't know what day exactly it was, other than I don't have to go today, and this is awesome. And so as we sat through the morning and we woke up to our cereal, we all kind of asked ourselves, the four of us that remained behind, well, that was unique, that was different. And there was just a mood, there was just a heaviness / I don't know what to expect or think or do, but old enough to be home. And then my dad calls the house, and the rule was let the answering machine pick it up. And when the answer, if you don't know what that is, you can Google it. Let that pick it up, and when you heard mom or dad's voice, you picked up the phone. And my dad called, and we heard his voice, and he said, "Go ahead and get changed. Your sister is okay, but she's going to be in the hospital for some time. I'm going to come get you so you can see her." And what do you do when life happens like that? When you get a phone call, when something just hits you sideways, coming into church saying there's no water, what do you do as a pastor? Well, what am I supposed to do? I'm not a plumber. I'm going to figure it out. And so you just are trying to prepare for life and these different things. And as my dad came home and picked us up and we drove back to West Virginia where my sister was in a very serious car accident, saved, but hard to see a loved one with road rash and bruises and sleeping peacefully in a hospital bed, knowing she wasn't going to come home with you, knowing that she was maybe a few centimeters, a few inches from something more terrible. And you question in those moments, life. Is God good? My dad's a pastor. Why would you let this happen? And the mood just changes. It was just an off. And that's the question we need to ask is, when life what do we do? And how do we respond? And what should that response be? Where we've left off in Luke. Luke 15 was the prodigal son, and Jesus saying, look, there's actually more joy in heaven when someone repents and turns, not that there's more joy when God obliterates the sinner. To the shrewdness aspect, a contrasting view of saying, if you are stewarding the things and possessions that God has, if in this world we do that well with the worldly things, shouldn't we be more attention and more attuned to the godly things? And as they continued in Luke, we're jumping ahead to Luke 22. And what's setting up is this Last Supper that Jesus has, in one sense, made everybody angry and mad. He's left the authorities frustrated. And in one sense, the flaming liberal and the MAGA conservative are joint and are now allies. And that would be the Sadducees and the Pharisees of that day. That they were so at odds and enemies that Jesus has angered both of them that they both connive and say, we don't like him, so we're going to take him out. He's joined the horrible forces together to conspire to kill him. And it sets up this Last Supper in Luke 22, where it's called coming to a climax of the ministry of Jesus. That he's pushed, and as he comes to the Last Supper in the upper room, where we celebrate Easter at that time, that it was the Passover meal. And as they gather together for this very holy, and what's very traditional of Jesus would go to Jerusalem for these celebrations, these festivals. And as they prepare the upper room for it, a fight erupts over the dinner table of who is the greatest. They're bickering over who's going to be greater in God's kingdom. And Jesus quietly gets up, and it's where he takes a towel and he wipes everybody's feet, which was the servant's role. And he says, look, in my kingdom, it is different. You think you're to lord it over, and you have, by being the top CEO, the top that you get to just tell people, no, the greatest among you will serve you. And in one sense, the disciples should have been serving Jesus, and Jesus says, no, this is how it looks of servant leadership, is the greatest among you is the one who serves. And then you read chapter 22, verse 31, where we pick up the story today, and it says, Simon, Simon, which is referring to Peter. They've had this issue of who's the greatest, and Luke declares and says that, it's those that serve. Simon Peter, behold, Satan demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. Kind of foreshadowing that, Peter, Satan has asked permission, one, to come at you. Second, you're going to fail. And when you're restored, encourage your brothers. And you see it here, he's sifted, and there's a couple key things to take away from this, is that first and foremost, Satan asks permission. That in the midst of our struggles, in the midst that and you can say, was this a spiritual warfare? I don't know, could be. We're doing something right and you face that, but Satan's not under every rock. Sometimes he sets things into motion, but what you have to come at the end of the day is, who is the king, God, and who is the underling, Satan, and what does he have to do? He has to ask permission, and sometimes God allows things to happen, not to harm us, but they might hurt. There are growth points. There are different points that there is the principality of darkness in the world we face. He has to ask permission, and you read 1 Corinthians 10:13, it speaks to the fact that if you're in Christ, there's no temptation that has overcome you. It's not that life won't overwhelm you. When I got to the hospital to see my sister, it just kind of, you don't know what to expect, first time kind of in a hospital in that type of setting, and it just kind of made me, not numb, but just, what is this? This isn't normal, this shouldn't be. And for just someone from the church to wrap her arms around me, one of my Sunday school teachers, and just said, Nick, it's okay to cry. It's okay to grieve and to see the hurt. And I did. Life will overwhelm, but the temptation to sin, it says there's no temptation that has overcome you except what's common. But in your predicament, God will provide a way of escape. Meaning if your eyes are on the prize of Christ, you, one, will face temptation, you will face life and hardships. And he'll send the people around you. We'll get to that in a moment of what he does in his greatest work. But the thing is, the temptation piece, he is going to ask permission to sift us. And God has given us the ability. In fact, Psalm 23 says he promises peace in the midst of the trial. Not that you will not go through the storm, but that you will actually go through the storm, but there is peace in the midst of it. Job 1 and 2 speaks to this. And Peter's response to, I'm not going to reject you, God. I'm not going to do this. He says, Peter said to him in verse 33, Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and death. Like, I'm ready to take on the Roman military. I'm ready to go. Let's do this. And Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster will not crow this day until you deny me 3 times that you know me. Sobering, right? But Peter to get rejected of like, what you mean, Satan wants to sift me. And you tell me I'm actually going to do it. No, I won't. I won't fail. But you will. And so for you and I, how do we guard against when life happens? What do we do? Well, first point, if you're taking notes, if I prayed like Jesus, my prayers would appear a certain way. Because after this, after Peter trying to disrupt, says, I won't deny you, Jesus says, you are. And then he describes in the next few verses that if you live by the sword, and they said, oh, look, Lord, here's 2 swords. He said, enough. Kind of like you're not getting the point. And so they traveled to a place that Jesus would have been very, very familiar with called the Garden of Gethsemane. Some of us are familiar with that term. And it was owned by somebody else, but Jesus frequented it. And how do I know that? Because as we get through the story, Judas finds him there. It wasn't advertised that he was there. It's where he visited. And he says in verse 39, and he came and went, as was his custom, which tells you again, this is a normal pattern for Jesus, to the Mount of Olives. And if you're in Jerusalem, if you Google Earth this, you can see the Mount of Olives is directly to the right. It's a hillside, and the Garden of Gethsemane is at the base of this hill. And when he came to this place, he said, pray that you may not enter into temptation. And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, saying, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And there appeared to him an angel from heaven strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. If you want to highlight, circle that. That's a key point that Luke is a doctor. And so he's showing us some medical terminology here, and he's preparing for what lies ahead of the stress and the anxiety that he's going through. In 45, and when he arose from prayer, he came to the disciples, found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation. If I prayed like Jesus, my prayers would appear in the sense what you see Jesus, he's wrestling. Father, if this could be removed from me, he knows what lies ahead with the cross. He knows he's going to be rejected. He knows he's going to go through physical pain and all of the tantamount of being rejected. And he's asking, right there, let it be removed. If you're willing to remove this from me, please. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And so what he's asking is he's wrestling with, I kind of know where this is going, but I can ask that I don't really like it, I don't really want to, and God, if you could remove it, please do. At the same time, I'm willing to go through with it. That your will be done in my life, not what I want. And you see, as the angels came and ministered to him, and he prayed more earnestly, the sweat and blood, that tense anxiety would make your skin, if you read The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, he talks about it, it just made his skin very sensitive and brittle. He's so stressed and he's so knowing what is coming that his skin is almost preparing itself. And so if you get to this point medically, you can sweat droplets of blood, which would make him incredibly to touch. If you think about what lies ahead and what that would mean then for the sensitivity. How do we then fight temptation and sin? Verse 45, and when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and he found them sleeping. He said, why are you sleeping? Rise, pray that you may not enter. How do we fight temptation? How do we fight sin? You pray. You spend time with Jesus. And it's a conversation. And what does that mean? If I prayed like Jesus, my prayers would appear very brief. Like, I don't know about you, but sometimes my prayers are, Lord, would you please give me wisdom in this situation? And that's kind of it sometimes. Your prayers will probably be brief, like the Lord's Prayer. We know that prayer. Your will be done, not mine. And we go through that to remind us of the things that he has. Verse 22, we would be brief, but they'd also be brutally honest. Psalm 22:1 says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? God, help me, I need wisdom. Brutally honest. And Jesus cries that Psalm 22 on the cross. They'd be brief. If I pray like Jesus at times, they would be brutally honest of this is what's going on in my life and just kind of raw. Again, if you think of God as your father, as your Abba, he can take it. Sometimes it's scary for us. If you knew how I was feeling inside, if you knew where I was, it's me going into my sister's room at the hospital and saying, I got this. I can just hold this together. And just a simple permission like, it's okay to cry, Nick. It's okay to see that this is hurting. And to recognize, to be honest with where you find yourself. What does Jesus say? We have a phrase in churchisms, come as you are. And that's the truth, is come as you are. Don't stay as you are, but come as you are, where you find yourself. And sometimes it's brief in prayer and brutally honest. It's showing up. It's shamelessly persistent. Repetition. Okay, my son, he's at the age where he loves Nerf guns, okay? So he's constantly, you want to have a Nerf war, Dad? Want to have a Nerf war, Dad? Want to have a Nerf war, Dad? I get home from work, Nerf war, Dad? Before bed, Nerf war, Dad? Dad, can you show me some Nerf guns? Like, incessantly persistent is the young boy to where it's like, all right, I need to go give him a Nerf battle. And just for the record, yes, I enjoy shooting him very much at times. It's a Nerf gun. It's not going to hurt too bad, but he likes to hide behind the couch and stick his head just up, so I always hit him on the top of the head. Dad, you can't shoot me in the head. Judah, you got to move then, move. But it's that utterly persistence here of the shameless persistence that he doesn't know. He just keeps asking. I've probably said no more times than we've actually done Nerf wars or Nerf battles, but he's constantly coming about it. In fact, Matthew 7, verse 7 and 8, you keep asking, keep knocking. In John 16:24, Jesus says, ask anything in my name so that your joy will be complete. Doesn't mean that you ask for X, Y, and Z and you're going to get X, Y, and Z. That's not usually how it works. But as you're shamelessly asking for X, Y, and Z, sometimes your heart changes and you realize that's actually not what I need, but God, what your will is actually this, of Jesus here saying, I don't want what's about to happen, but I'm willing. And so as you're shamelessly persistent, your heart starts to change. Your mind starts to shift a little bit towards what God would you want. And it's that persistence that if it's important, don't stop asking. Again, I think of Mueller, one of the great heroes of my faith, he's long dead, but he prayed for friends. And his friends, a few friends, 50 years incessantly praying that they would come to know Christ. And the last one did not come to Christ until it was at his funeral. It's that incessant persistence that if you say it's important, then keep talking about it. I'm going to throw the guys, I'm sorry, I'm a guy, I'm going to throw us under the bus. Here's where I say, well, what's nagging with a wife to a husband? I would say, tell them once, that's not nagging. Tell them twice, that it's not here yet. 3, 4, probably 5 times you're safe. And for me, sometimes it is. At least she'll tell me, Nick, this, oh yeah. Nick, did you get, oh, not yet. Nick, did you get, third, Nick, yes, got it, 4th time. And it's that if you tell me once, I may have the intent, I may mean to. But if something is important, then you keep going. You keep incessantly. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12, verses 7 to 10, he says, look, God has given me a thorn in my flesh. And the beautiful thing about Scripture, it never tells us what that was. And he says 3 times I pray that it would be removed, meaning there's probably more than 3 times that Paul prayed that whatever that thorn, whatever that issue was that he wrestled, that he struggled with, that it was important to keep bringing it. And God said, my power is made perfect in your weakness. And so he got his answer. The answer was no. And he moved on. But he is shamelessly persistent of consistent to ask for my spouse, who I long for maybe to know Jesus, or who I want to be better. Am I praying persistently for them? It's your children that as you see them go and grow in life that you shamelessly, because here's the thing, I have a 7, a 5, and a almost 2-year-old, and I can't control them as much as I want to. And some of you have adult children that you really can't control. And they make decisions and they do things, you're just like, you're driving me bonkers. But what do? We shamelessly, persistently ask and pray, God, would you give them wisdom? My prayer for my kids is that God would soften their hearts and their minds, that he would be made Lord of their lives, that they would come to know him. And it's every night. My son asked me just last night, Dad, why do you always pray with me at night? Oh, Judah, I love you. And Judah, it matters. And Judah, it's important. And why do you always pray the same things? Because Judah, those things are important. It's the shamelessly persistent with it, of going after it. And then humbly offered, of recognizing what is God? God gives grace to the humble. That God desires to see our hearts and our minds, and we recognize where we stand before a holy God, and we recognize, wow, I don't deserve it. But there's a mercy that he gives. And so if I prayed like Jesus, they'd probably be brief a lot of the time. They'd be brutally, honestly, they'd be shamelessly persistent, and they'd be humbly offered to say, Lord, this is where I am. Junk and all, crap and all, this is where it is. And so what I do before the crisis determines how much strength I will have in that crisis. What did Jesus tell Peter here? He says, Peter, look, you're going to be sifted. Satan's asked you, you're going to fail. And when you're restored, in a sense, strengthen your brothers. Now I won't fail. And what does Jesus model to him? This is how you strengthen yourself and prep for. And you pray. You prep. It's like Andy Stanley talks about it. He says, you put guardrails in your lives. Why do you put guardrails on the side of the road? So that when you rub up against it, you don't go off the edge. And so it's putting guardrails. What do I do? What I do before a crisis, because you cannot predict. Like that phone call in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. You can't predict those phone calls. You can't predict when something in life just hits, and it's what are you going to do in the midst of that? It's going to be, I know where to go. I know what to do. And what you read in the next part of the story in Luke 23 is that after this, Jesus prays, and then Judas comes to the garden with the guards under cover of darkness. He zeroes Jesus out. He betrays him with a kiss. And even at that point, Jesus is still offering him. And then all the disciples, verse 54 and 22 says, then they seized him. Meaning Jesus led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. And Peter was following at a distance. All the disciples book it. They're gone. And Jesus has just prayed, and all of his friends have left him. And what happens to Peter? That he denies him 3 times. Verse 60, Peter said, man, the 3rd time, I do not know what you are talking about. When they're asking, your accent gives you away. Your accent says you're a Galilean. Your accent says you're with him. Aren't you there? And he starts to pretty much cuss at them. Immediately while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned. I don't know if you ever read this. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the saying of the Lord. Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. He knew he blew it. In the court, and he just blew it. And then Jesus is mocked and put on trial. And what you find as you read through the end of chapter 22 is that Jesus is just silent. He doesn't offer a defense. He doesn't go after and say, I need my 10 minutes. I need to defend myself. No, he quietly is prepared and goes through it. He's silent in it. He doesn't argue, doesn't prove his innocence. And you read chapter 23, verses 6 to 17, highlight here. When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. They bring him to Pilate because they say he needs to be killed. The Jews don't have that authority, so we're going to take him to the authority, and they string him up and bring him over to Pilate, who is the Roman governor of the city. And as he stands before Pilate, Pilate realizes, how do I get out of this? What most politicians do, you get caught. How do I push this away? How do I deflect this? And so he recognizes, oh, you belong with Herod's jurisdiction. You're in the town over. So he sends Jesus to Herod. And Herod in verse 8 of chapter 23 says, when he had long desired to see him because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some signs done by him. So he questioned Jesus. The chief priests and the scribes stood by vehemently accusing him, and Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. They arrayed him in splendor clothing. He sent him back to Pilate, and Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day. Before this, they had been enemies with each other. Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers of the people, and he said to them, you brought me this man as one who was misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I do not find him guilty. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him. He's still trying to slough it off. You want him dead. And at this point in the story, when life happens, is you have the whole aspect of the Last Supper. And Jesus trying to say, be ready. And then you move into the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus modeling to pray to be ready for what happens next. His disciples have left him. They've put him on trial, a sham trial. He enters one word and they condemn him. They send him to Pilate, the governor. And as Pilate says, I don't want to deal with this. I'm going to send you to Herod because Herod, you're in his jurisdiction. And Herod goes, I can't find him. I'm going to kick it back up the pipeline to the CEO. Back to you, Pilate. Pilate says, I have nothing. I don't want this on my conscience. I'll punish him. I'll do that. And instead the people, and as they led him away, they seized, and again it says, but they all cried together in verse 18, away with this man and release us Barabbas, a man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection, starting the city, and for murder. And they shout down Pilate's pleas of innocence of, no, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. So what's our key to courage in the midst of this? When you see chapter 23 of Luke, that after Jesus is condemned to crucifixion, Pilate sends him away. And you can read this of what goes on and what that actually looked like of the crucifixion and the peace. But in verse 24, so Pilate decided that their demands should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. And they led him away, and they seized one, a Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. And there followed him a great multitude of people and of women who were mourning and lamenting for him. But turning to them, Jesus said, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore, the breast that never nursed. And what Jesus is again doing is, as he's going to be crucified, where he's already been scourged, and we're not going to go into that detail. He's been beaten, he's been abused. They're sending him to the cross to humiliate him even more. And in the Old Testament, it said, cursed is everyone who's hung on a tree. And that phrase is important because in Genesis 1, you see creation. Genesis 2, you see a focused in creation story. In Genesis 3, you see sin come in, and God says, you are now cursed. There's a curse upon us because of our sin, our disobedience to God. And so the only way to be made right with God, if the first two humans, Adam and Eve, were sinners and had sin, they passed that down to their generation. Guess where we all come from? Adam and Eve. And so the only way, if we're already dead, is for someone to substitute themselves in our place. They have to be a curse for us. And so when Jesus is bloody and beaten and he's hung on the tree, he becomes that curse for us. And yet even here, as he's about to become that curse for us, as they lead him away, his focus isn't on him. It's on them. It's on the other. His eyes are still on the future. In verse 39, as he's led up and as he's hung on the cross, in verse 39, one of the criminals who was hanging railed at him, saying, aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us. In a sense, blaming Jesus for, oh, you did that. I can't believe you did that. Blame, blame, blame. But the other who was hung with him rebuked him, saying, do you not fear God? And since you are under the same sentence of condemnation, And we indeed justify, for we are receiving the due reward for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. You have two examples. One who in the midst of his suffering blames for all his poor choices, it's your fault, Jesus. And the other one turns and recognizes, I know where I stand and I know why I'm here. This man's done nothing, and rebukes the other. And what does Jesus say to it? And we indeed justify in 42. And he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he said to him, Jesus, truly I say to you, today you're with me in paradise. What did he do? Luke 15, he turned, he recognized, and he repented, and he came back. And what right there. The key to courage is giving thanks for the good while going through the bad. There's no, courage is that. It's the courage to do the right thing. It's the courage to keep going forward, even in the midst of it. I love this definition of trauma because it's somewhat of a hot button thing right now in church world. There is a thing called church hurt. I've grown up in the church. I've seen it firsthand, experienced firsthand, but it is a reality, and we're just kind of dealing with it, so it's going to be around for a while. But I like this. It says that the state of trauma, this is the definition for trauma, that, and for the record, if you say you don't, you do. Okay, all of us do in some various forms, some worse than others. But trauma is the state of woundedness and the story that arises from living in that state. So let me repeat that. The state of woundedness, that you've been wounded, you've been hurt, and the story that arises from continuing to live in that wounded state. It's like when you have a broken bone, it doesn't heal right, and you continue to have it unhealed. What do you have to do if it didn't heal right? You actually have to go in and re-break it, which is hurtful, painful, to let it heal correctly. Another one is trauma is a wordless story our body tells itself about what is safe and what is a threat. It is pain that we stop feeling that continues to go on hurting us. Why is there alcoholics numbing things? Why is there those coping mechanisms? Why are they? Again, trauma, it's a wordless story our body tells itself about what is safe and what is a threat, whether true or not. And it's pain that we stop feeling over time that continues to go on hurting us. And prior to Jesus coming, that's where that was our state. We lived in trauma. We lived in sin. And what did Jesus do? He came and became a curse for us through healing in his name, power in his name. Does that mean instantly? No. Because you see, when you deal with trauma, sometimes the wounds are deep, and sometimes you need to acknowledge it. But then there's the forgiveness piece. Okay, forgive what's done. But then there's repercussions of said trauma. And when it talks about that in Scripture, that God, that, from multiple generations, the generational sin, why is that a curse that goes down? Because you learn it. And in Cortland, New York, where I was at, do you know what the biggest issue was? Generational sin? Incest. And that was trauma that's been passed down from generation to generation to generation until someone has the courage and the ability to break that. I come from a long line actually of alcoholics that my grandfather was able to stop it, but his brothers and his sisters were all alcoholics. That my great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather, that's what I come from on both sides. And it's whatever has happened, they grew up in the Depression. And in the midst of the pain and suffering, what does God say? Today you'll be with me in paradise. In verse 44 of chapter 23, it says, it was now about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And while the sun's light failed and the curtain of the temple was torn in two, then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. And when the centurion, the soldier, saw that had taken place, he praised God, saying, certainly this man was innocent. And all the crowds had assembled for this spectacle. When they saw what had taken place, returned home, beating their breasts. And all his acquaintances and the women who had followed him from Galilee stood at a distance with these things, and he's buried. You know how much, if you're following this Jesus and he's dead, like it's done, what would you be feeling in that moment? If you're one of those women who are following at a distance, if you're one of his disciples seeing this, are you going to be giving thanks? Probably not. And Jesus is buried, and I wish I could end it, but next week, Pastor Greg gets to bring it to fruition with the resurrection and the coolness of that. But the key to courage is giving thanks in the midst of the bad. It's keeping our eyes on perspective of it. You see, God does his greatest work right in our places of deepest pain. Healing itself is very disruptive. Healing is a long, slow disruption, and the healing that we need deepest, you and I, cannot be between me and Jesus alone. The primary way that he heals us is in community through people. That afterwards, what does Jesus tell Peter? That you're going to deny me, you're going to fail, and then when you're restored, encourage the brothers. Don't just go off and solo ranger, but encourage the brothers. Use your story. You don't think Peter was a little bit traumatized about seeing that Jesus said, you're going to deny me? He denies him. Jesus looks and he says, oh, crud. Boy, I really failed. And when you read the Gospels to the end, he restores Peter. He restores him back. And so for us, for you and I, the key to courage is give thanks and just show up. Just be present. You know, the biggest thing when I went to the hospital with my sister and seeing and being scared of not knowing exactly the extent was just that Danielle showed up with her husband Lou. They just showed up. And they didn't say it had to be okay and you're going to get through this and God has a wonderful story for you and he's going to use all things to be good. They just said, it's okay to cry. It's okay to be hurt in this moment. And to just be present. What does Jesus do all through the gospel is he just shows up. That he is present in people's lives is what you see again and again and again. So where do you find yourselves as it's nice and raining outside? We're going to get wet, folks. Keep going. Yeah. Oh, we have water. Woohoo! Looky there. I think we're still going to the creek is what we're doing. It would take a little bit. So I'm going to pray, and then I'm going to invite parents to grab their kids because we're going to do the testimonies here since it is raining as much as it is. We're going to have parents grab your kids, hang here. Here's what it's going to look like as we close out this morning. Parents are going to grab the kids. They'll come in here. We're going to hear testimonies, and then we'll walk down, we have umbrellas. We've got stuff for you. And then we're going to pray over them, and we're going to sit them in the creek, and we're going to baptize them. And that's how it's going to work as we close. But let me pray, and then we're going to take a quick pause for parents, do a 7th-inning stretch, and then hang out right where you are. Since we do have water, that means the restrooms are available. Let me pray. God, we are grateful to be here. And as we look at this concept, Jesus, that when life happens, what do we do? Lord, we trust you. And if that is true, then Lord, allow us to, in the midst of the pain and suffering, wherever we find ourselves, that we trust you. And to know that the courageous thing, Jesus, many times is just show up. To not have it all figured out, to not know but just to show up and to recognize we do have a story. There's things that have gone on and maybe we've run from those things for a long time. But Lord, when you came and you died, it was to bring healing. To bring healing, but also, Lord, to bring reconciliation to you, that we could have hope that in this world we will have trouble, but you bring us through it. And so, Lord, we can be like Peter at times where, no, we're not going to fail, and then we fail. There's going to be crisis that comes upon us, Jesus, that we're not going to know what to do. But may we model what you did as you showed us in the garden of just come to you and pray. Maybe it's short, it's humble, it's brutally honest. And the courage to say, your will be done in our lives. Not what I want, but what you want, Jesus. It's what you want in this home. It's what you want in my relationships and all things. And so we ask, Jesus, that you would soften the hearts and the minds of each and every one in here. And Lord, that we would shamelessly and persistently ask for the things that you've called us to love one another, that we would be present with you in and through all things. And so we ask, God, that you would guard our hearts and minds this morning, that as we get to celebrate baptisms as they go under the water, death to themselves and new life in you, Jesus, that we hear this, that we can cheer and celebrate even in the midst of the rain. And Lord, that we're just going to follow you, we're going to trust you. And so we ask for your grace and your peace in all of this. In Jesus' name, amen.